In hindsight, there's a lot of little things scattered throughout Darling in the Franxx that I find to be legitimately impressive. Taking the time to pick apart some of these episodes in preparation for this video has made me come to really appreciate the approach to storytelling found in the anime. That being said, if you've heard anything about this anime, then you might have heard about the ending at some point. More specifically, about how the ending is not very good. My experience with Darling in the Franxx feels a little awkward because when you remove the last handful of episodes, then I practically have no complaints or criticisms. If I really wanted to, then I could list off a couple fairly minor ones, but these are so inconsequential in the long term that I don't think it's even worth bringing them up. But the ending is such a curious disaster that despite how much I enjoyed everything preceding it, the totality of Darling in the Franxx is left with a fairly awkward final impression. So that's the quick, spoiler-free version of this video. There are going to be spoilers for both the Darling in the Franxx anime and the manga from beyond this point. As is tradition, let's begin with episode 1, or rather, let's begin with the first 6 episodes. These episodes are largely about the establishment of its core characters and the central dynamic between Hito and 02. The best place to begin with should be 02, since I'm actually quite a big fan of how the anime approached this character during its first 6 episodes. During much of these episodes, we don't learn a whole lot about 02 from 02 herself. Rather, her introduction to the viewer mostly consists of the rumors surrounding her. So much of these early episodes are less about 02 as an actual character, but rather the portrayal of 02 through the perspectives of other characters, most notably Hito and Ichigo. Ichigo sort of represents the collective views of the rumors about 02 as the partner killer. I only say sort of because Ichigo does try to reason with 02 a little bit, but never really sees past the rumors and 02's non-human status. Given her pre-established reputation within the Darling in the Franxx universe as the infamous partner killer, I actually really like that the anime goes out of its way to avoid having 02 from commenting on the situation that much. Rather than trying to reason with the viewer that she isn't such a bad person, we're almost exclusively subjected to the already biased perspectives in order to strongly confirm her reputation instead of disputing it. And it's not just through words either, as the anime happily provides physical evidence to support those rumors. The partner she's seen flying in with at the start of episode 1 is found practically dead at the end of episode 1 once Strelitzia opens up. After piloting a Franxx with 02 once in episode 3, Mitsuru is severely injured and traumatized. Then there's also the blue pulsing growth that develops on Hito's chest paired with an overall decline in his physical health. In the meanwhile, 02, aside from her obsessive usage of the word darling, simply mentions that if Hito dies as a result of piloting with her, then he didn't amount to much in the first place. The anime clearly had an idea of how they wanted to handle 02 during these early episodes that they fully committed to, and the end result is fantastic. I grew to heavily dislike 02 during these episodes. I fell for the biased perspectives and found myself in the same shoes as most of the children in these plantations. But this general early distaste for 02 is more like a backhanded compliment about the anime's approach to characterization rather than a direct criticism aimed towards her. So let's then jump to the other side of the central dynamic and look at Hito. 02's status as the partner killer came to be because every single one of her partners never survived beyond their third excursion with her. Because there's 24 episodes, they obviously weren't going to actually kill Hito on the third excursion. If they did, then we'd be having a completely different discussion today. So, since the episode count makes it pretty clear that they probably weren't going to kill him, the question then becomes about how do you make both the lead-up and the execution of the third excursion interesting. Once again, I'm a big fan of how the anime handled this. As far as the first 2 instances of piloting are concerned, there's really not much to say. Everything is mostly peachy. The first instance does have the caveat that Hito doesn't remember anything about it, which does sustain its own sense of mystery while it lasts. Hito is fully aware of the circumstances surrounding 02, but he's still very much willing to throw himself into Strelitzia alongside her. After the second time, Hito develops a growth on his chest and his physical health begins to decline. However, in episode 5, he insists to Goro that he doesn't want anybody else knowing about this because he doesn't want anyone to try and stop him from piloting Strelitzia. In previous episodes, Hito had repeatedly expressed his desire to pilot a Franxx, and no one can really blame him for wanting to do so. All of his other squad mates were officially verified to pilot them, after all. Only Hito and his partner didn't make the cut, and his partner left the plantation shortly after. For the first 3.5 episodes, the anime doesn't do much to dispute this. Instead, similar to how it handled Zero Two's reputation, it instead reaffirms what we already knew. However, in the back half of episode 4, the anime does go out of its way to change this. In a desperate confession, it's revealed that Hiro doesn't actually care for piloting a Franxx, but rather wanted to ride again with Zero Two. The anime provides this emotional anchoring point for Hiro's actions to be measured up against, and this is why I find the scene of Goro finding out about Hiro's growth to be quite good. It provides a substantial and, more importantly, visible justification for Hiro's behavior and his willingness to put his life on the line that goes beyond just Zero Two's reputation. It's a much more up-close and personal look at exactly how Zero Two affects her partners, which once again helps finely tune the viewer's perspective of Zero Two in these early episodes. The third excursion happens in episode 6, and it begins largely with a continuation of all the things we've become familiar with so far. The growth on Hiro's chest expands out to his face and arm as his physical state becomes even worse. Meanwhile, Zero Two hardly seems concerned about it, and even when Hiro stumbles for a moment during combat, she just asks him if that's all he's got, as if she's on the verge of disappointment. And I know that I mentioned earlier that Hiro obviously wasn't going to be killed off because there's still so many episodes to get through, but they do. Almost. Hiro takes one step across the line and is ready to accept his death until he steps out of it when he sees Zero Two desperately screaming and struggling against the Klaxosaur alone. And it's in that moment that Hiro realizes that he's been looking at the picture incorrectly the entire time. He was always concerned about what Zero Two could do for him, but never the other way around, and once that clicks for him, he brings himself to support Zero Two, and everything is lovely once again. Leading up to this moment, there was a significant amount of focus put into portraying Zero Two in a certain manner, which the anime happily throws completely out the window in the later parts of episode 6 in exchange for Hiro finding a new purpose within himself. The combination of those two elements of those two characters really highlights the anime's ability to illustrate multiple, complex character moments together into a single dramatic spike. And I know that the previous sentence sounds so pointlessly specific in regards to just that moment, but the anime does something structurally identical in a later episode, and it's just as good as it was here, if not even better. As far as I'm concerned, those two moments are the two highest peaks in Darling in the Franxx. In summary, the successes of the first 6 episodes stems from the anime's ability to characterize Zero Two purely through the perspectives of others in order to set her up for a moment of surprising vulnerability. Hiro, through the revelations he has about himself during these episodes, finds a new purpose within himself in response to that moment of surprising vulnerability, which sets up the crux of their dynamic for the remainder of the anime. Before we get around to talking about that second peak, let's get sidetracked for a moment and talk about side characters. There's a batch of episodes, 7 through 11 specifically, where the majority of the attention is dedicated to these side characters. One character that I want to keep split apart from the rest of the side characters is Ichigo. I think there's a completely reasonable argument that Ichigo is just as important as Zero Two and Hiro during the first 6 episodes, but we've already crossed that bridge, so I won't dwell on that here. The anime displays the conflict between her personal feelings for Hiro and her recognition of a leadership role quite well. There's a very clear effect that her feelings are having on her actions, but Ichigo also attempts to remain cool, calm, and collected at all times while trying to minimize conflicts within her group, meaning that she's willing to let things go even if she's not personally happy with the outcome. While she has faltered a few times, episode 5 is the first instance in which she finally loses it and lashes out against Zero Two, going as far as calling her out for not being human, which strikes quite the nerve in Zero Two. I quite like that scene because of how it simultaneously touches upon the more complex elements of each character in a fairly seamless manner. Darling in the Franxx has a fairly solid but imbalanced cast of side characters, which is to say that some side characters get a lot more written about them compared to others. Ichigo is the obvious example where there's so much more for her early on that calling her a side character during those episodes feels pretty iffy. Mitsuru and Kokoro start out pretty slow, but with episode 11 and then the short arc of 16 through 18, there's tons of details illustrating both of these characters and their dynamic. Goro gets almost all of episode 9 dedicated to him, and looking outside of episode 9, he's generally a slightly more involved side character because of his fairly regular interactions with Hiro. This ends up leaving us with Zorome, Miku, Ikuno, and Futoshi, who are definitely the less substantial side characters. Zorome does technically have episode 10 dedicated to him, but that episode always came off as an exercise in world building to me rather than an exploration of Zorome's character. Futoshi and Ikuno have moments that are dedicated to them in episodes 11 and 18 respectively, but they are still fairly minor moments in the grand scheme of things. Biku is the only character that I'd say doesn't really do anything. She has this one bit in episode 8 when she gets into one of the sealed rooms, but to argue that that's an important aspect of Biku's character certainly feels like I'd be stretching it. I'd say that episodes 12 through 15 are probably my favorite set of episodes in the entire anime, and it's largely for the same reasons why I like the first 6 episodes so much, building up several complex character arcs and having them climax all together in a single dramatic spike. It all starts with a pretty major focus on Zero Two. In episode 12, Zero Two shows quite a high level of aggression towards killing Klaxosaurs, and outside of combat displays a seemingly high level of stress. The episode reveals that the reason she kills Klaxosaurs is because she believes that once she eventually kills enough of them, she will become human. And the reason behind this is so that she can meet her darling from the past again. I'll just do a quick shout out here to episode 6, where Hito asks Zero Two why she fights Klaxosaurs, and Zero Two responds by saying that it's maybe because she's a monster. Episode 13 contains the full backstories of Zero Two and Hito, and no stone is left unturned here. Overall, I really like both the contents and the presentation of the backstory, but the most important takeaway is that Hito is the darling from Zero Two's past. The strength of these two episodes lies in their ability to over-illustrate the extent of Zero Two's mistake that takes place at the end of episode 12 when she tries to, for the lack of a better word, consume Hito. Zero Two's motivations and her backstory is told in a clear and straightforward manner to the viewer. The actual significance of Hito in Zero Two's life cannot be emphasized enough, and the fact that they were able to be together again seems almost like a stroke of destiny, even if Dr. Franxx did eventually bring Zero Two to Plantation 13 to see if there'd be any sparks left between her and Hito. And now Zero Two has nearly killed the most important person in her life in her path to meet that same person again, even having gone as far as slowly turning Hito into the monster that she was and will become. This change in Hito isn't visually signified until later when he starts developing horns of his own, but in episode 12, it's mentioned that Hito's body has begun to change to a degree that he might no longer remain human. So when Zero Two and Hito realize who each other really are, you can see both the heartbreak and clarity that strikes Zero Two as she realizes that she fucked up. That moment does a lot to purify Zero Two's character, as episode 12 poured a lot into turning Zero Two into an obsessive and aggressive personality that doesn't align at all with her previous mannerisms. It contributes a lot to making Zero Two's desire to see Hito again throughout episode 14 feel just that much more sincere and desperate. Speaking of, in episode 14, there's two pretty distinct sides fighting against each other here, Hito and Zero Two wanting to see each other again and the rest of Squad 13 stopping them from doing so. The best aspect of episode 14 is how it's able to very clearly depict the motivations powering both sides of this conflict. Zero Two and Hito had a massive emotional breakthrough in the prior episode, yet they're unable to talk to each other about this breakthrough. Ichigo and the rest of Squad 13 never got to see this breakthrough happen and are exclusively concerned about Hito's safety. I was expecting some kind of reconciliation to happen between Hito and Zero Two in this episode, which would have mostly come in the form of a lot of sitting down and talking. The truth is that we actually get none of that, and the viewer is denied a satisfying conclusion to the conflict. Just as Ape decides Zero Two's destination on her behalf without consulting her, Ichigo blocks Hito and Zero Two from seeing one another without consulting Hito. The mounting sense of frustration in Zero Two is made extremely clear to the viewer, all while Squad 13's motivations remain just as clear and, more importantly, relatable. After all, there was something extremely similar to this present within the first 6 episodes. When discussing those episodes, I mentioned how I fell for the biases present within some of the characters due to their perspective of Zero Two. In the context of episode 14, Ichigo's perspective has reverted back to what was seen during those early episodes. If anything, it's become an even more extreme version of it. She knows that she's effectively become the villain to both Zero Two and Hito, but it's a hit she's willing to take because of her strong belief that this is all in Hito's best interests. Her perspective here is pretty clearly more important than the rest of Squad 13 because she's the one that's the most vocal about it. Even during those first 6 episodes, Hito and Zero Two had the same desire to be together. Yet the difference in episode 14 compared to the first 6 episodes is that the anime has taken the time to change the viewer's perspective of Zero Two by showcasing things about her that aren't only through the lenses of other characters. I haven't even mentioned the fact that this episode involves 2 big spikes in tension involving Zero Two, when she sees Hito missing from his room and when she realizes Hito's true identity. We've already talked about the second spike in tension earlier, but that's not to say that the first spike in tension isn't any less important. It's what leads into the moment of Hiro calling 02 a monster, and similar to how you could see an extreme and instant shift within 02 in the second moment, you can quite clearly see the lights go out in 02's eyes as the resignation sinks in. So while the structure of what you see in episode 14 might be very similar to the things present in the first 6 episodes, it still results in a fundamentally different experience. This episode is excellent, and I would pretty confidently say that it's my favorite episode of the entire anime. The anime's decision to go with the unsatisfactory ending that leaves even more loose threads hanging is what ends up hitting the hardest. 02 continues to turn back into a monster as her horns and canines keep growing, and she's never able to reconcile with her darling about her past actions. Ichigo believes that she's doing what's best for Hiro even if he may hate her for it, while Hiro simply wants to see 02 again. The final scene of episode 14 depicts Ichigo confessing her feelings to Hiro as he watches the airship containing 02 fly away, which encapsulates the entire situation in a simple but perfect way. After how brutal the previous episode was on the two of them, it's really nice to see Hiro and 02 get back together in episode 15. It strongly reflects the first time they piloted together with a plantation under crisis, and one of the two being downtrodden as all hell with the other coming in to essentially save them. One thing that the anime did really well in this episode was how it depicted 02's continuous decline into becoming a monster, the most notable example being the sheer size her horns grew to be. The on-screen text, even though it is extremely direct and on the nose, is something that I also found myself liking a lot, because it's another unique way in which this transformation is depicted that I don't think would have been as impactful if it was just narrated. The font increasingly warping itself with each iteration is the biggest contributor to this factor. The little extra slice of backstory that's given here of 02 devouring her precious picture book being her first step to becoming a human is also great because the anime did a lot of work previously to establish how much importance this picture book holds to 02. And even though it was told really directly, I'm also very satisfied with Hiro's reasoning as to why he finds 02 to be so important to him as a child, with them both being the only ones that wanted to fight against the garden, albeit in different contexts. Episodes 16 through 18 is a short little arc that provides a more calm and relaxed tone compared to the arc preceding it, which is fine. This previous arc marked a huge turning point for the story, so things slowing down to give the show some breathing room is perfectly understandable. Life in Mistletoe seems more harmonious than ever before now that the rest of the plantation has been destroyed, and the adults of the society have cut themselves off of the squad for the time being outside of ration deliveries. As simple as it is, the squad cooking themselves their own meal and ignoring prayers is a pretty obvious representation of them becoming more independent and separated from the adults. Were some parts of this arc pretty corny? Yeah, but that's also the point, right? The children knew very little about life outside of piloting Franxx, and it being kinda corny here and there helped sell that aspect of their characters. That links up to the core focus of this arc, the children realizing that there is more to life than just piloting Franxx, then going ahead to actually establish this for their lives as well. There's two more things to this arc that I'd like to touch upon. Firstly, 02 seemingly has overcome her desires of wanting to look like a human. From what she said, she's realized that there's more to being human besides just how they look, most importantly in their emotions and interactions. There's a huge difference in how she interacts with other people now compared to earlier, even when she was on good terms with them all those episodes ago. It contrasts nicely with her previously growing obsession with the mirror. It also parallels the scene from episode 8 where 02 steals everybody's clothes and Hiro goes around chasing her. Good character growth. The second thing to touch upon is that there's a pretty noticeable focus on the growing level of intimacy between Kokoro and Mitsuru, including the consummation of their relationship and a wedding. There's also a whole sequence involving the Nines and Kokoro expressing her desire for a child that adds to this. The anime does a great job at building up towards the wedding scene, which is important because it's the reason why I like the ending to this arc so much. The Nines and some soldiers come in to stop the wedding and take away Kokoro and Mitsuru. The next time we see the two, their memories have been blocked, similar to how Hiro used to have his memory about 02 blocked. It goes as far as the two not even being able to recognize each other. The ending is pretty great because of how it rips away all the things that the children grew to know and literally love. Even the remainder of Squad 13 isn't completely exempt to this, as they're taken away from Mistletoe to be kept in the same facility as the other parasites. The anime spent most of 3 episodes building everything up simply to pull the rug out from beneath both Squad 13 and the viewer, but rather than this being a twist for mere shock value, this one felt inevitable but impactful. And now we're left with a handful of episodes from 19 through 24. By episode 15, it feels like so much of the entire story was nicely wrapped up. Sure, there are some question marks about world building that are left unanswered, but the larger story feels quite complete. And while 16 through 18 adds some extra bits and pieces to this quite complete story, it still feels like a well-written expansion to previously established elements. And then you realize that there's something like 6 or 7 more episodes left. As I alluded to at the top of this video, I'm not a huge fan of this ending. The existence of this ending in its current state doesn't ruin what came before it or anything, but it certainly makes things a lot more awkward to approach. We can begin by taking a look at the change in presentation of world building, but in order to do so, we first need to talk about how Darling in the Franxx approached the presentation of world building in the first place. One of the consistent themes present throughout Darling in the Franxx is the distinct separation between children and adults. The main ways in which the anime showcases this is in the children's belief that they themselves will become an adult one day, as well as the anime's persistent avoidance in explaining the process of becoming an adult. Spoilers, but the children will never become adults. Children simply don't make it to adulthood in the world of Darling in the Franxx. There's an emphasis on subtlety accomplished by telling most of the story from the strained perspectives of the children through a mix of the children being misinformed and having a limited intake of information. Darling in the Franxx takes advantage of this by providing smaller answers and reveals here and there, while bringing in a steady stream of slightly larger questions to keep things perpetually intriguing. Episode 10 is a good example of this. You finally get to see what a normal adult in this society is like, while the anime also piles on the question of how things got to this point. Episode 7 is another good example with how it reveals that the children are completely unfamiliar with the most basic elements of both physical and emotional human intimacy, but it also raises the question as to why the children are unfamiliar with these basic elements in the first place, while 02, the only non-human present in that scene, seems quite familiar with it. Misinformation in Darling in the Franxx mostly comes in the form of the children's blind faith in Ape. As some of the children speak praises and prayers about their beloved Papa, the anime provides more and more suspicious details about Ape by giving the viewer unfettered access to their discussions that most of the characters don't have. All of these things add up to create a nice air of mystery to Darling in the Franxx that you wouldn't expect from just looking at some of the surface level content. It's a really nice way of bridging world building and the story's tone together. So how are things different in this final block of episodes? Things are too straightforward when it comes to the reveal of the history of Klaxosaurs, the origin of the Franxx units, and how the world came to be in its current state. The actual history itself is pretty interesting, especially the end of the Klaxosapien race and the origins of magma energy, but dragging and dropping most of it into a single episode while using the most stock standard form of storytelling, that being direct narration, makes a lot of the episode rather dull. Similarly, Dr. Franxx's backstory is interesting, but the bland presentation of it puts a dull coat of paint over the entire thing. The problem that arises from this is that there are too many answers provided all at once in an uninteresting manner while failing to raise any substantial questions in the process. That slow trickle of world building and mystery that added a lot to the story's tone is now completely out the window, and it certainly marks a massive transition in Darling in the Franxx, where its previous subtlety is replaced with a rather grandiose affair. The anime suddenly feels like it got put on a time crunch for its last batch of episodes. The introductions of both the star entity and Verm feel very hastily put together, while everything you need to know about these things are just given to you directly. The Klaxosaur Princess, or Code 001, is an underwhelming character who feels more like a minor nuisance rather than a legitimate threat. Her display of power is frankly disappointing, and her sole purpose feels like she was meant to be plugged into Strelitzia Apis? It's Apis or Apis? Strelitzia Apis to turn that into the focal point of a conflict. Her getting the star entity all fired up and the giant laser she fires off once is kinda neat, but the anime weakens her so quickly that it doesn't feel like we actually saw what the princess's potential for destruction could have been. And I know that sounds a little weird given that she does fire a giant laser that destroys an entire fleet of alien spaceships, but given that the anime does a very poor job at depicting the strength of these ships, it fails to leave much of an impression. Darling in the Franxx had a surprisingly grounded core to its story despite all the mechas and dinosaurs being tossed around everywhere, but once it turns out that the solution to their problem of 02 being unresponsive is out in deep space in the middle of battling this fleet of enemy alien ships that was just introduced, things start to feel pretty overplayed and melodramatic because the scale of the problem just got exponentially bigger and now has all these bells and whistles attached to it. It doesn't feel like the careful approach to characterization present throughout much of the previous episodes at all. A few things scattered throughout pile onto this problem bit by bit as well. The method by which they actually go into space involves them taking a leftover Klaxosaur ship which they somehow have the ability to pilot. I can't vouch for the exact translations, but the subtitles I saw literally says that for some strange reason, they could access its internal systems. The sheer level of extreme convenience provided this is pretty laughable to me because it kind of represents the general feeling of this last arc being tacked on at the very end. Strelitzia True Apath, I don't remember how I pronounced it previously. Strelitzia True Apis is really out of place visually because her design very awkwardly straddles the line of being a human-dominant design versus a mecha-dominant design. All the other Franxx units looked nice in my opinion because it was merely a human expression being displayed on an otherwise wholly mechanical design, which made it a nice way to add personality to these otherwise cohesive visuals. True Apis's design lacks cohesion because there's a far too clear divide between the parts that are 02 and the parts that are Strelitzia, and the whole thing is very jarring to look at. I guess some credit should go towards True Apis kinda looking like 02 wearing a wedding dress because that is admittedly rather appropriate in the thematic sense. There's also a few storylines that were soundly completed but were repeated all over again because they needed something to fill up the episodes. The Mitsuru and Kokoro one I'm almost okay with, as you can make a fairly legitimate argument for them since their memories were altered, but I honestly cannot understand the decision to briefly but almost completely undo a lot of 02's storyline of her getting over her desire to become a human. They found a way to close it out really nicely but just had to back it up and run over the tracks again for some reason. I also don't understand the decision to bring back all the supposedly dead children that the garden discarded by revealing that they were just kept underground the entire time. The fact that we didn't know the fate of those children was one of the things that contributed to the mysterious aspects of world building, and that aspect of it has just been made pretty much irrelevant in hindsight. One of the larger components that contributes to the ending's problems is Verm. Verm basically just appears out of thin air because they needed someone to be an antagonist for this last block of episodes. Pretty much little to no setup or foreshadowing about this exists aside from the sort of suspicious aura surrounding Ape. The actual idea itself is okay, but there's just not enough episodes here to try and construct a proper story surrounding them as the primary antagonist. Their ending isn't even satisfying at all because they aren't fully eradicated. Sure, a lot of their shit is blown up by the Klaxo bomb, but they're sitting right there in the void of space talking about how they'll be back someday as the souls of 02 and Hito Blue spin away into oblivion. Verm surviving really takes the wind out of this part of the ending. If they just started screaming and faded out like they had Exodia played on them or some shit like that, it'd be pretty silly, but at least it wouldn't have this weird dampening effect on their victory. I don't know, it doesn't have to be anything exactly like that, but just having something to properly mark the defeat of Verm would do wonders here. Setting all that aside, there's a couple okay things here and there within the final chunk of episodes. There was something really heartwarming about seeing the world come together and humans flourishing once more, as it provides a nice sense of finality to the anime. There's also the scene of Goro calling out Hiro about his selfish tendencies involving 02, which I kinda wish happened a lot earlier in the anime, but I guess it's better late than never in this instance. And that's about all I have to say in regards to the anime. I like it a lot. In terms of characterization and world building, there is so much that is done really well. Episodes 1 through 6 and then 12 through 15 had approaches to 02 and Hito's characterization that were fantastic, all while providing a legitimately tense build-up towards a satisfying peak. But the existence of the final arc of the anime completely baffles me. It somehow is so much less polished, but so much more poorly paced compared to everything preceding it that it makes me want to assume that something must have gone horribly wrong during the production process, which is why the existence of the manga is so interesting to me. I'm going to list off a few dates here that I lifted off of Wikipedia. The original run of the Darling in the Franxx anime was from January 13th of 2018 to July 7th of the same year. The manga began serialization on January 14th of 2018 and ended on January 26th of 2020. The only volumes that were released within the same window of time as the anime's original run were volumes 1 and 2, which were released in February and May of 2018 respectively. For anyone whose eyes are beginning to glaze over, the last line is the only thing that's really important. I rattle off all those dates simply because it's a convenient reflection of the relationship between the anime and the manga. The anime and the manga both start quite similarly, and for anyone that hasn't read the manga, you're probably expecting me to say that while they start similarly, they end up becoming quite different. That's not necessarily true. There are some pretty big differences between the two mediums, don't get me wrong, but the DNA of both stories are unmistakably identical. The manga essentially tells the same story as the anime, but it takes quite a different approach to this same story. Let's get a little more specific to make the image a little more clear. The list of episodes that are completely absent from the manga are 12, 16, 19, 22, 23, and 24. And by completely absent, I mean that there's basically no traces of these episodes to be found within the anime. That doesn't mean that the episodes I didn't list off just now are completely intact though. There are a handful that are mostly intact and resemble what you see in the anime fairly closely, but there's a lot of these episodes where bits and pieces are taken and reorganized or combined into different scenes, while another number of scenes received anywhere from minor to absolutely massive changes in terms of the actual content. Like I said, it shares the same DNA as the anime and tells the same overall story, but the approach to organization and sequencing results in a noticeably different experience. I'll begin with some smaller scale stuff before expanding into the bigger picture. Mitsuru doesn't get the same kind of interactions with 02 in the manga. Instead of volunteering to pilot with 02 and Hito isn't given the clearance to do so, then almost dying for it, Mitsuru makes the offer to 02 directly. She doesn't care and dismisses him. During the scene where Mitsuru normally pilots Strelitzia alongside 02, the manga allows for Hito to pilot it instead, which is now treated as his second excursion. The fight that takes place in episode 4, which was originally his second piloting event, has been merged with the fight that takes place in episode 6, with Hito's convention being repurposed as part of the build-up towards this combined fight. Remember how I said Miku doesn't really do anything in the anime? Well, they actually gave her a more dedicated scene in the manga with its different interpretation of the events of episode 10. Rather than Zorome getting lost in the city by wandering off on his own, this scene has been reworked so that Miku is the one that runs off after Zorome says some hurtful things to her. Zorome chases after her, followed by 02 chasing after them, followed by Hito chasing after her. There is no adult in the manga that comes to rescue Zorome and chats with him. Instead, the four that are in the city spot an adult hooked up to one of their happiness machines through a window, and 02 explains the circumstances surrounding that view. Instead of Goro being trapped inside the Klaxosaur back in episode 9, it is instead Ichigo that is trapped inside. A new aspect of this sequence is Ichigo activating Delphinium's Stampede mode while trapped inside in order to try and destroy the Klaxosaur core by herself. This replaces the sequence of Goro contemplating, then deciding to activate Delphinium's self-destruct mechanism. There's also the addition of a small scene involving 02 using the computer in the command room to determine that Delphinium was still within the Klaxosaur and that Ichigo was still alive. This sequence also merges some bits of episode 8 into the story of episode 9 as well. The partner shuffle is suggested by the children to the adults rather than vice versa. Futoshi recognizes the level of emotional support that both Kokoro and Mitsuru provide one another, and suggests the idea alongside Ikuno despite it clearly being something that he doesn't want for himself. During the first piloting attempt between Kokoro and Mitsuru in the anime, Mitsuru becomes dejected and Kokoro attempts to activate Jenista's Stampede mode. In the manga, a lot of it remains the same, but Mitsuru attempts to self-destruct and save Kokoro before Kokoro activates Stampede mode. Rather than their newfound bond ending here for the time being, they unlock the ability to then become Genista Light Armor mode. As you can tell, the structure largely remains similar, but the changes are still pretty noteworthy. That's not an exhaustive list, by the way, as there are other changes similar to that scale alongside a bunch of minor tweaks to things such as settings and dialogue to a number of scenes. But instead of listing off every single one of those because that would just get tedious, there are 3 much more substantial changes in the manga that I want to look at. One of these major differences, and the one that I would argue to be the most important, between the anime and the manga is how they treat the Klaxosaur princess as a threat. I've already talked about how I think the anime does a rather underwhelming job at painting her as a threat, but I'm happy to report that the manga does an excellent job at this very same task. In the anime, the princess's first major appearance is marked by her killing one of the members of Ape. Given that the anime does basically nothing to try and distinguish the individual personalities within Ape, this death feels pretty inconsequential. In the manga, the princess's first major appearance is in volume 6 when she confronts the Nines. In this encounter, she kills all but 2 of the Nines, and the stragglers are left in such a state that they have to send out a distress signal to Plantation 13, something that would be nigh unthinkable for the Nines of the anime. Rather than taking over Strelitzia, the princess instead takes control over one of the elite units piloted by the Nines, morphing it into Type Dragon. She also possesses the minds of one of the survivors from the Nines named Delta, and uses Delta to track down 02. 02 is then possessed and used to attack Plantation 13. I like this display of the princess's power far more than how it was handled in the anime. The 2 victims of the princess's power are 2 characters that we're familiar with, the Nines and 02. While the actual display of power itself might be less destructive compared to the anime, it is still more impactful overall. The key to this is that there's an actual opportunity to witness the aftermath of the princess's powers. Even if the scale of destruction is smaller, being able to see the consequences helps better illustrate the actual impact the destruction has on the story. The destruction that the princess causes in the anime is rather inconsequential, as the casualties mostly amount to a single member of Ape and a fleet of alien ships. The consequences seen in the manga, however, are shown in much greater detail. The first of the two victims we'll talk about is the Nines, as they have some other major changes outside of their involvement with the princess. As I said before, the princess pretty handily kills all but two of the Nines, which puts some massive cracks in their reputational armor that the anime never did anything close to. This speaks largely to the manga's more humanized approach to these characters, or rather character singular, since 9 Alpha is the only one that gets any substantial investment. Due to the princess slaughtering the Nines, Ape abandons them and calls for their disposal via pruning, whatever that may be. Delta is unconscious and Alpha is half blind, and Alpha seems aware and accepting of their impending fate. They're rescued by Squad 13, and Alpha spends a fair bit of time observing the humans as he stays in Misteltein, and grows to care more about them. Alpha and Delta eventually join forces with Squad 13 for the Battle of the Grand Crevasse. Looking at things that happened before the princess showed up, it's worth mentioning that Alpha's first appearance in the manga is actually during the interaction between Ichigo and 02 during the night before Hito's third piloting venture. Alpha also appears to intercept Strelitzia's self-deployment for that very same battle. I don't really feel in either direction in regards to how the Nines were handled in the anime. However, I find Alpha's changes over time in his perspective of humans to not only be an interesting subplot to follow, but also something that grants a bit more substance to his character overall, especially when compared to his anime counterpart. It's not something that changes the story a whole lot in the grand scheme of things, but it certainly adds a fair bit to it that the anime never quite could. All that's left to talk about now is 02 once again. More specifically, we're going to talk about the parts of the manga that correspond with episodes 13 through 15 in the anime. This is where things become a tiny bit more complicated because of how much was shuffled around and reorganized in conjunction with new content. The starting point that I'm going to mark here is the moment in which 02 turns on Hito within the cockpit of Strelitzia, and this is where we can already start marking the differences between the two mediums. The actual lead up to that moment is fairly similar between both mediums, with 02's level of aggression increasing from fight to fight. In the anime, this moment is triggered during an inconsequential battle at or near the garden. In the manga, this moment occurs after 02 has been possessed and attacks Plantation 13. During that attack, when Hito gets inside Strelitzia, 02's horns have grown out of control, which is in contrast to her horns growing out of control at the end of the arc in the anime. However, the most interesting difference between the two versions is how 02 responds to the restoration of Hito's memories. Compared to the anime, things are a lot simpler in the manga. After 02 realizes Hito's true identity, she leaves the squad, albeit now free from the princess's influence. Her reasoning is that 02 believes nobody in Squad 13 would see her as a friend anymore due to her deceiving Hito, and that being alone is the punishment that she deserves. While that covers most of the important differences, there's just one more detail that I want to briefly call out before I talk about this section as a whole. While 02 and Hito reunite and unlock a new scarlet form of Strelitzia, the actual fight surrounding this is quite different. The fight in the anime is against a massive Klaxosaur that directly attacks Plantation 13. However, in the manga, the fight is against the princess and the star entity. The core difference between 02's reactions across the two mediums is where exactly the motivation to leave the squad stems from. The anime provides an external motivation where 02's decision is fueled by Hito calling her out for being a monster, yet the manga provides an internal motivation where 02 makes her decision based on her own judgment without input or influence from anyone else. It sheds a much more different light onto 02. The anime's approach puts her in a position of pity because we as the viewer know the truth about the situation, but nobody in Squad 13 is willing to hear her out, and she's called a monster by her very own darling. The manga puts not necessarily a more positive, but still a brighter spin onto 02 through her acceptance of her own actions. It shows a sign of maturity out of her that was never quite present throughout the anime. I'm not here to say that one of these was done better than the other, because frankly I don't believe that's the case here. I like both of the ways in which the two mediums handle this arc, despite the rather significant differences. I guess I lied earlier about only 3 substantial differences, because here's a 4th one. Nobody goes to space. Absolutely splendid. Verm just dips out after setting off Star Entity. Wonderful. The manga feels like a more fine-tuned and polished version of the anime story, with a lot of the excess fat having been trimmed off. That might sound like I prefer the manga more than I do the anime, but that's not necessarily the case here. As I brought up earlier, much of the DNA is the same, but it's the experience that's fundamentally different. As far as major plot points are concerned, most of them start and end in the same places across both mediums, but it's how you get from the start to end that's different. Given that I really enjoyed both versions of Darling in the Franxx, I think much of the credit has to go towards the central story itself, having very solid fundamentals and characters to support it. That pretty much does it for Darling in the Franxx as a whole. I didn't expect to enjoy it as much as I did, but I also never expected the ending to be as awkward as it is. Maybe there's a world in which Darling in the Franxx gets a remastered anime that combines both the best aspects of the original anime and the manga to create a fully finalized version of the story. One that preferably doesn't go to space, please. Okay. Welcome to the outro. Before we get started on anything out here, I just wanted to say thank you so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking it and maybe even subscribing to the channel. Every little bit always goes a long way for channels of my size. So now that that's been said, welcome to the outro. I just have a handful of extra notes about Darling in the Franxx that I couldn't really find anywhere to easily fit into in the main video, so they're here now because I wanted to still mention them and make sure they weren't going to waste. In episode 1, the first thing that Hiro notices about 02 is her horns, despite her jumping out of the water completely naked in front of him. It's a cool way that ties into the focus on her horns later on in episodes 12 through 16 and such. Episode 13, during the reveal of the backstory, the word darling is censored, but still completely obvious to the viewer, which makes for a fantastic click moment as to why 02 loves using that word so much. Again, it's just another one of the reasons why I think that episode is so good. Continuing on with episode 13, the contents of 02's beloved picture book being shown page by page at the end of episode 13 makes for a very emotional yet haunting moment. I think a lot of the haunting feeling can be attributed to the art style and the music, the crystal clear parallels between the picture book and Darling in the Franxx as a whole, and once again the censorship of the word darling. And on a general note, there's a rather frequent use of the letterbox effect. It was kinda neat the first few times, but the repeated usage of it really does wear away at the novelty of it. And that is, this time for real, really real, the last thing I have to say about Darling in the Franxx. I don't know what the next video is on yet. I have a couple things I'm bouncing around on inside that I still need to make a decision on, but I do know that it's going to be a short video, something akin to the Spy Family video that I released last month in terms of length. So that's all I have to say for the time being. Once again, thank you so much for watching if you stuck around until this part of the video to hear me say this, because, you know, not everybody does that, so a special extra thanks to you. And yeah, that's it. I'm actually out of things to say now, so take it easy.